This is not a breaking news update. This is not a theory, and this is not speculation. What you are about to hear comes directly from a handwritten letter, written in the middle of an unfolding true crime case, involving two children, Lilly and Jack. In cases like this, every word matters. Not because it proves guilt or innocence, but because it reveals the psychological state of the person writing it. Tonight, we focus on the language, the structure, and the emotions captured on paper. In true crime analysis, letters like this are often overlooked, yet they can quietly reflect stress, trauma, and behavioral patterns that interviews and headlines never show. This video does not accuse, defend, or conclude. Instead, we examine this letter through the lens of forensic psychology, analyzing what is said, how it is said, and what is noticeably absent. Sometimes, understanding a case begins not with answers, but with understanding the mind behind the words. First, I want us to listen carefully to the full letter, from beginning to end. As a mother, I love my children more than life itself, and feel so heartbroken not being able to hold my two children, Lilly and Jack, kissing their breath in there, sent or tuck them into bed, dress them, wake up, to their sweet smiling faces. The longing I have for them to come home back to me is a greater feeling that I could never imagine feelings or pain to words. How I am feeling, there is not one single day, minute, or second that goes by that I am not thinking about my children. I walk into a store and all I see is things they love that I want to get for them when they come home, and they like the clothes they wear, the toys they love. All I see is them. I so desperately just want them home safe and sound back into my arms where I will never let them go. I am truly traumatized not being able to hear the sweet sound of their voices, their laugh when they would sing a Gabby Doll House song that now only makes me cry when I hear it, because all I hear is Lilly and Jack singing along, not being able to breathe in their scent when I embrace them tightly. I don't want these moments to be memories. I want my babies back home, my Lilly May and Jack. The pure pain I suffer of just not knowing where they are has impacted my life in Meadows and my family in the Azores. Most devastating way. Life feels extremely hard to keep going with no answers. It is just pure loss, like I can no longer feel at home anymore. No matter how lost I feel, I have not ever given up hope that my children will be returned home to me safe and sound. I have all the faith and hope I will see them again. Please, anyone with any information, no matter how small, please come forward. Please do not be afraid to use your voice to help bring home Lilly and Jack. Even the smallest details are crucial. I am so incredibly grateful and thankful for all of the ongoing efforts of the Pictou Major Crime Section, RCMP, and Pictou County Major Crime Unit and Crime Stoppers. Your hard work is appreciated more than, you can share tips anonymously at pictoucountycrimestoppers.co or contact the RCMP. I will never stop searching for my children until they are found and brought home safe and sound. Someone somewhere knows something, so please help bring my babies home. To the incredible volunteers, searchers, and investigators, and compassion and kindness you have stood beside. Thank you for your tireless dedication, your prayers, your time spent combing through woods and areas, sharing photos and refusing to give up on us. You have shown me that love, kindness, and compassion still shine even in the darkest times. Everything you've done has not gone unnoticed. Thank you with deepest gratitude. Malehya Brooks Murray. The letter opens without context, without background, and without explanation. It begins directly with emotion. This is significant. In forensic psychology, how a document begins often reflects the writer's immediate mental state. There is no attempt to guide the reader or explain circumstances. Instead, the letter moves straight into feeling, suggesting the writer is overwhelmed and focused inward rather than outward. From the first lines, the language is dense and continuous. Sentences stretch on with minimal punctuation, creating a sense of urgency and emotional overflow. This pattern is commonly associated with acute stress responses, where thoughts arrive faster than they can be organized. The letter does not pause to structure ideas, because the writer's mind is not yet in a place of order.
I know Malehya didn't do
A
anything.
dominant
I know my
theme
mother
throughout
didn't
the
do
early
anything.
portion of the
Those are
letter
three people on the
is
property.
physical closeness. The
I mean,
writer
after the polygraph
repeatedly
exams,
references
they should have
holding,
known right there.
touching, and being near
We
her
didn't kill any of
children.
the kids.
These are
We didn't
not
kill the
abstract
kids.
ideas of love. They are concrete, bodily experiences. In psychological terms, this reflects a strong attachment bond centered on daily caregiving rather than distant identity or roles. The focus on ordinary routines is striking. Tucking children into bed, dressing them, waking up to their faces. These are not dramatic moments. They are quiet, repetitive actions that define everyday life. Trauma often causes individuals to fixate on the last known sense of normalcy, because normal routines represent safety and predictability. The letter repeatedly references sensory details, particularly smell. Sensory memory is deeply connected to emotional memory. When individuals experience sudden loss or separation, the brain often clings to sensory impressions as a way to maintain psychological connection. This is not a deliberate choice, but an automatic neurological response. Throughout this section, the writer does not describe events. There is no timeline, no sequence, and no description of what occurred. Instead, the entire focus remains on absence. The pain expressed is not about what happened, but about what is missing. This distinction is important in behavioral analysis. The repetition of phrases related to time is also notable. The writer emphasizes that there is not a single day, minute, or second when the children are not on her mind. This reflects rumination, a common response to stress where the mind loops continuously around the same emotional center without resolution. The letter frequently shifts between present and imagined future moments. The writer speaks about seeing items in stores that she wants to buy for her children when they come home. This blending of present reality with hoped-for future scenarios indicates a psychological effort to preserve hope while managing distress. Language associated with the home appears repeatedly. Home is described not just as a place, but as a state of emotional security. The writer expresses feeling unable to feel at home without her children. In trauma psychology, loss of a sense of home often reflects destabilization of identity and safety. Another key feature is the personalization of the children through names and affectionate references. Naming reinforces emotional proximity. Rather than distancing language, the writer draws the reader closer into her emotional world. This is consistent with expressions of grief and longing rather than emotional detachment. The emotional tone of this section is raw and unfiltered. There is no attempt to soften the pain or present it in a composed manner. This lack of emotional regulation suggests the letter was written during a period of intense distress, rather than after time had passed for reflection. The writer also describes being affected physically by the emotional experience. Difficulty breathing and feelings of trauma are mentioned. In forensic psychology, physical descriptions often accompany emotional overload as the body and mind respond together under stress. Notably, there is no external focus in this portion of the letter. No mention of other individuals, no reference to responsibility, and no engagement with outside narratives. The psychological attention is entirely internal, centered on loss and longing. The absence of analytical language is also important. There are no questions asking how or why. This suggests the mind is not yet in a problem-solving mode. Instead, it is operating in an emotional survival state, where understanding comes secondary to coping. The letter uses strong absolutist language, such as never and always. Absolutist terms are common during periods of emotional crisis, when feelings dominate perception and leave little room for nuance or uncertainty. Another pattern is the repetition of the desire for safety. The phrase safe and sound is emotionally loaded and appears more than once. This indicates a singular psychological priority, restoration of safety rather than explanation or resolution. The writer expresses fear that memories may replace lived experiences. This fear reflects anticipatory grief, where the individual begins to imagine a future defined by loss rather than presence. Anticipatory grief often emerges when uncertainty persists over time. There is also a clear indication of emotional exhaustion. The writer describes life feeling extremely hard to continue without answers. This does not suggest hopelessness, but rather the heavy cognitive burden of ongoing uncertainty. Despite the overwhelming distress, the letter does not end this section in despair. There is a stated refusal to give up hope. In trauma psychology, this coexistence of pain and hope is common, especially in situations involving unresolved separation. Taken together, the first part of this letter presents a psychological snapshot of a person experiencing acute emotional trauma, intense attachment distress, and cognitive overload. The language is not strategic or performative. It reflects a mind attempting to process overwhelming emotion through words. At a certain point in the letter, there is a noticeable change. The emotional flow that dominated the opening paragraphs begins to slow. The language becomes more controlled. Sentences shorten. Ideas become more clearly separated. In behavioral analysis, this type of shift is rarely accidental. It often signals a psychological transition from emotional release to intentional communication. This transition does not erase the pain expressed earlier. Instead, it reframes it. The writer moves from describing internal suffering to addressing the outside world. This suggests a moment where emotional expression gives way to purpose. In forensic psychology, this is sometimes described as the reassertion of cognitive control after emotional overload. The introduction of direct requests marks this change clearly. The writer now speaks to others rather than about herself. Phrases asking anyone with information to come forward appear. This outward focus indicates that the mind has shifted from processing loss to attempting action, even if the emotional weight remains unchanged. The tone in this section becomes more deliberate. The writer chooses words that encourage participation without pressure. There is no urgency framed as fear, only as responsibility. This matters because emotionally driven manipulation often relies on exaggerated threat language, which is notably absent here. Another important feature is the inclusion of institutional names. Law enforcement units and tip lines are referenced with specificity. In psychological terms, naming external systems reflects trust in structured processes. It also signals an acceptance that the situation extends beyond personal control. The presence of gratitude is also significant. The writer pauses to thank investigators, volunteers, and supporters. Gratitude during ongoing distress can function as an emotional anchor, allowing the writer to maintain connection to others rather than becoming isolated within grief. The language used to express appreciation is consistent and measured. It does not exaggerate contributions, nor does it frame helpers as saviors. This balance suggests sincerity rather than performance, aligning with authentic emotional expression. The request for information emphasizes that even small details matter. This phrasing reflects an understanding of collective effort rather than individual heroism. Psychologically, it invites collaboration without placing burden or blame on the audience. Importantly, this section does not attempt to control the narrative. There is no instruction on what to think or believe. The writer does not frame events in a particular light, but instead focuses on the shared goal of reunification. The repetition of the phrase safe and sound reappears here, but with a different function. Earlier, it expressed emotional longing. In this section, it becomes an outcome-oriented goal. This subtle shift demonstrates cognitive restructuring under stress. The writer maintains hope explicitly. Hope is not framed as certainty, but as commitment. In trauma psychology, this distinction is crucial. Hope based on commitment allows individuals to continue functioning without denying uncertainty. The letter also reinforces persistence. The writer states that she will continue searching until resolution is achieved. This statement reflects determination rather than desperation. The language avoids absolutes about outcomes, focusing instead on continued effort. Throughout this portion, the writer remains careful not to speculate. There are no assumptions, no interpretations, and no implied scenarios. This restraint is psychologically meaningful, especially in high-stress situations where speculation often emerges as a coping mechanism. The shift toward community acknowledgement strengthens social bonds. By recognizing volunteers and supporters, the writer positions herself within a network rather than alone. Social connection is a key protective factor in prolonged stress situations. There is also a moral framing present, but it is subtle. Words like compassion, kindness, and dedication appear. These values reinforce a shared human response rather than a conflict-based narrative. The letter avoids dramatization. Even when describing effort and dedication, the tone remains grounded. This restraint reduces emotional escalation and keeps the focus on cooperation. The structure of this section suggests intentional composition. While still emotionally driven, the writing now follows a clearer sequence: request, acknowledgement, gratitude, reassurance. This organization reflects regained executive functioning. Despite this regained control, the emotional core does not disappear. Pain is still present, but it is now contained within a functional framework. This coexistence is common in individuals navigating ongoing uncertainty. Notably, the writer does not attempt to redefine herself or her role. She remains consistent in identity throughout the letter. There is no shift towards self-justification or explanation, which can sometimes appear in public statements under pressure. The language used to address helpers emphasizes equality rather than hierarchy. Volunteers, investigators, and supporters are grouped together. This reinforces collective responsibility rather than authority dependence. The closing tone of this section is steady rather than dramatic. It does not escalate emotion for impact. Instead, it settles into a message of persistence, gratitude, and shared purpose. From a forensic psychological perspective, this middle portion of the letter demonstrates a transition from emotional expression to behavioral intention. It reflects a mind under strain that is still capable of organizing thought and directing action without resorting to manipulation or avoidance. One of the most revealing aspects of this letter is not what it contains, but what it omits. In forensic psychological analysis, absence can be as meaningful as presence. This letter avoids many elements that typically appear in public statements connected to high-profile cases, and that restraint shapes how the message is psychologically understood. There is no retelling of events. The writer does not describe when, where, or how circumstances unfolded. No timeline is offered. This absence suggests that the purpose of the letter is not to inform or clarify facts, but to express internal experience and request collective assistance without framing a narrative. The letter also avoids speculation. There are no imagined scenarios, no assumptions, and no hypothetical explanations. Under prolonged stress, people often speculate as a way to regain a sense of control. The absence of this behavior suggests the writer is not attempting to fill gaps with interpretation. Notably, there is no mention of blame. No individual, group, or situation is identified as responsible. In forensic linguistics, Blame-shifting language often appears subtly through implication or contrast. Here, such language is entirely missing, which affects how the emotional intent is perceived. The writer does not attempt to defend herself. There are no statements asserting innocence, good character, or moral standing. Defensive language often appears when individuals feel scrutinized or judged. Its absence here indicates the focus remains on outcome rather than perception. There is also no attempt to influence opinion. The letter does not guide the reader toward a specific belief or conclusion. It does not frame events in a way that would encourage sympathy through contrast or comparison. The emotional appeal remains direct rather than strategic. Another absence is anger. Despite the intensity of the emotional pain described, there is no outward expression of rage or hostility. In trauma responses, anger often surfaces as a secondary emotion. Its absence suggests the emotional energy is directed inward rather than outward. The letter avoids legal language entirely. There are no references to rights, processes, or outcomes. This reinforces that the letter's function is not procedural, but personal and communal. It positions the writer as a participant in a shared effort rather than a legal actor. There is no attempt to dramatize circumstances. The language does not escalate or amplify fear. Words associated with danger or threat are notably limited. This restraint reduces emotional manipulation and keeps the message grounded. The writer also does not reference media coverage. There is no acknowledgement of public attention, scrutiny, or pressure. This suggests the letter is written from an internal need to speak, rather than as a response to external narratives. Another key omission is comparison. The writer does not compare her situation to others, nor does she use examples to justify her emotions. Comparative language often appears when individuals seek validation. Its absence implies the writer assumes the emotion stands on its own. The letter does not attempt to resolve uncertainty. There is no claim of understanding or clarity. Accepting uncertainty, rather than masking it with explanation, is psychologically significant in prolonged stress situations. The absence of future planning is also notable. Beyond the hope of reunion, there are no references to life beyond resolution. This suggests the writer's psychological timeline is paused, centered entirely on the present objective. There is no distancing language. The writer consistently uses personal relational terms. In forensic analysis, distancing can indicate emotional separation. Here, emotional proximity remains constant throughout. The letter does not minimize pain. There are no phrases that downplay suffering or suggest resilience as a conclusion. This honesty reinforces the authenticity of emotional expression rather than presenting a curated image. Another absence is instruction. The writer does not tell the audience how to feel or react. Instead, the request is limited to action, not emotion. This preserves autonomy for the reader and avoids coercion. The letter avoids moral judgment. There is no language dividing people into categories of good or bad. Moral framing can heighten emotional response, but it is absent here, keeping the tone neutral. There is also no reference to closure. The letter does not suggest acceptance or readiness to move forward. This aligns with ongoing uncertainty and avoids premature emotional resolution. The absence of narrative framing means the letter resists being turned into a story. Instead, it remains a statement of experience. This can make it more difficult to sensationalize, which may be intentional or instinctive. From a forensic psychology perspective, these omissions suggest a communication driven by internal need rather than external strategy. The letter prioritizes expression and action over interpretation or persuasion. Taken together, what is not said reinforces what is said. The restraint, absence of speculation, and lack of defensive language collectively shape a message focused on connection, hope, and collective effort rather than explanation or control. When viewed as a complete document, the letter functions as more than a personal message. It becomes a psychological artifact created under prolonged stress. In forensic psychology, such documents are often examined not for truth claims, but for what they reveal about coping mechanisms, emotional regulation, and the writer's relationship with the public. One of the strongest indicators in this letter is consistency. The emotional tone, values, and objectives remain aligned from beginning to end. Even as the structure changes, the core message does not shift. Consistency over multiple paragraphs often suggests internal coherence rather than reactive messaging. The letter also establishes a clear emotional boundary. While deeply personal, it does not invite intrusion into private detail beyond what is necessary to express loss. This balance allows public engagement without surrendering personal autonomy, a psychologically protective choice in high-attention situations. From a behavioral perspective, the letter reinforces a single identity throughout. The writer remains positioned as a parent seeking reunion, not as a spokesperson, advocate, or commentator. This stability and identity helps prevent fragmentation under public pressure. The public-facing nature of the letter introduces another psychological layer. Writing to an unseen audience requires emotional translation. The writer must transform private pain into language that others can receive. The clarity achieved in the latter half of the letter reflects this translation process. Importantly, the letter does not escalate emotion to command attention. It relies on authenticity rather than intensity. In media psychology, authenticity often resonates more strongly than heightened drama, especially with audiences fatigued by sensational narratives. The inclusion of gratitude serves multiple psychological functions. It reinforces social bonds, affirms shared effort, and reduces emotional isolation. Gratitude also helps regulate stress by redirecting focus toward connection rather than uncertainty. The letter's calm persistence contributes to its public reception. By avoiding urgency framed as panic, it allows readers to engage without feeling overwhelmed. This increases the likelihood of sustained attention rather than short-term emotional reaction. Another key element is the absence of contradiction. The letter does not revise or correct itself. Ideas build rather than compete. This structural harmony suggests the message was internally resolved before being shared publicly. The letter also demonstrates emotional containment. Pain is present, but it is held within language rather than spilling into chaos. Emotional containment is a sign of resilience, even when distress remains intense. From a community psychology standpoint, the letter invites participation without assigning responsibility. Readers are asked to help, not judged for inaction. This inclusive framing strengthens collective engagement. The public impact of the letter is shaped by its restraint. By not offering explanations or conclusions, it leaves space for readers to reflect rather than react. Reflection encourages empathy rather than polarization. The letter's tone aligns with long-form public appeals rather than short-form media statements. This suggests the writer prioritized depth over reach, trusting that sincerity would travel further than repetition. In terms of psychological timing, the letter appears written during an active coping phase. The writer is neither in denial nor in resolution. This middle state is often the most emotionally complex, requiring both endurance and adaptability. The focus on continued effort rather than outcome is another important marker. Emphasizing process over result allows the writer to maintain purpose even when certainty is unavailable. The letter also avoids redefining the situation through labels. By resisting categorization, it prevents the emotional experience from being reduced to a headline or role. From a forensic perspective, the language does not suggest rehearsal or scripting. Variations in sentence length and tone reflect natural composition rather than polished messaging. The emotional transparency displayed can increase public trust, not because it persuades, but because it does not attempt to control interpretation. The letter's closing reinforces connection rather than closure. It does not resolve emotion, but it stabilizes it. This leaves the narrative open-ended in a way that mirrors the lived experience. The psychological weight of the letter lies in its endurance. It does not seek immediate response, but sustained awareness. Endurance-based appeals often resonate longer than urgent calls. Taken as a whole, the letter functions as a bridge between private grief and public participation. It transforms internal experience into shared responsibility without distortion. From a true crime analysis perspective, the power of this document is not in revelation, but in restraint. It shows how language can carry trauma without amplifying it. Ultimately, the letter stands as an example of how individuals under extreme emotional pressure can communicate with clarity, consistency, and purpose, even when certainty remains out of reach. As we reach the end of this analysis, it is important to pause, not to draw conclusions and not to assign meaning where none has been proven, but to recognize what this letter represents. It is not evidence, and it is not explanation. It is a psychological snapshot, a moment captured under extraordinary emotional pressure. In true crime analysis, documents like this remind us that behind every case file, there are real human experiences unfolding in real time. This letter does not answer questions. Instead, it shows how the mind responds when certainty is absent and hope must coexist with pain. Through language, structure, and omission, we see patterns of stress, attachment, control, and endurance. These patterns do not tell us what happened. They tell us how someone is trying to survive uncertainty. And in true crime, understanding behavior is often more valuable than chasing speculation. At True Child Cases, the focus is not on rumors or dramatic storytelling. This channel exists to examine cases involving children with care, responsibility, and psychological insight. We analyze public documents, interviews, and written statements to understand behavior, not to accuse, defend, or sensationalize. Every word matters, but so does restraint, especially when real families and real lives are involved. If you value thoughtful analysis over noise and context over conclusions, consider subscribing to True Child Cases. New videos explore cases through forensic psychology, behavioral patterns, and verified public information only. No speculation, no shortcuts, just careful examination of the details that shape understanding over time. Thank you for watching and for approaching these cases with the seriousness they deserve.